I'm hoping that gives you enough of a taste of the sort of the lyrical material, but also the vocal. I don't know exactly how you would say it, but sort of the vocal tones, the terminology that you sort of incorporate into his music, and the way that he's enunciating his lyrics as well. So just to clarify on some of the terminology that they've been using in their songs. So one of the words is twizzy, which is TWIZZY, which he says means twin. So he's using it in the sense of a friend, a mate, a colleague sort of thing. And there's also crank, which is KRANK rather than with the traditional C, which is referring to narcotics or drugs. And this is terminology that hasn't been seen. I haven't seen anywhere else. I've done some extensive research, and from interviews I've seen with the artists, it seems to be terminology they've made up. There's a whole more load of examples that I could give you. But what do you think about artists making up their own vocabulary and including it in their songs? I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a new thing. That there's been quite a long tradition of doing that, as a way of, in comic songs, just fun songs that but sometimes as a way of covering up obscenities. So euphemisms, you get alternative phrases for naughty words of different kinds. That's a common enough strategy. And then things which are more coded, slang terms that would only be understood by perhaps a very small set of people who are in the know. Particularly, if you're talking about drug dealing, drug taking, it's a really productive area of language creativity, invention. Slang terms coming in all the time, and those have come into music in ways that the censors, they quite often, they just weren't aware of what was being talked about, and they let it through. And so these days, we can look back at songs that were recorded in the 60s and the 70s, and we know now what they were on about. So this word crank, I mean, I can well imagine that just appearing as an invention, a one-off term that other people liked the sound of, and they thought, I'll start using that as well. From the forensic speech analysis work that I do, we know that surveillance recordings of members of drugs gangs, they quite often know or suspect they're being listened to, and so they'll just invent terms which they've decided, that'll be a term that we'll use until the authorities get wise to it. And I mean, I'm sure you know about this, but the first example you gave, the twizzy one, I mean, I can see why one form would lead to the other. It's a bit like Pig Latin or one of those things where you just add a suffix or a prefix to a regular English word and turn it into something that's a bit more street, or this is done for all sorts of reasons, code among school children or members of gangs or people who are into a particular sort of music, or
Okay, well, thank you for your insight there. I can definitely understand what you're saying in terms of there being sort of code names for sort of illicit activities and stuff like that, which sort of gives that sort of, I guess, barrier of entry, or the sort of separation between people that are in that world and listening to that music, and then, like you say, the authorities that aren't necessarily aware of all the slang terms and all of that. And also, like I mentioned earlier, there's sort of this growing intrigue in the artist that's sort of made up on this use of terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sort of like forums and, on Reddit and in fan communities and stuff like that, where the fans are actually using this terminology,
Mm-hmm.
and it's become sort of like a brand identity for the artist.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting in that, they've sort of just made up these words, yet they can be attributed to an artist, and they're sort of like a way of identifying other fans online and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting and sort of adds to the mystery surrounding the artist.
Yeah.
And as well, I wanted to ask you about, I believe they're called umlauts, which are like the two dots that would appear above a letter.
Yeah.
I think potentially in like German and that sort of language.
Yeah.
So this artist used quite a lot of those umlauts
Okay.
within their song titles and things like that.
Yeah.
Not for any obvious reason, in that you wouldn't pronounce any of these words differently, and they're not foreign words, they're English words or slang terminology, just with these added umlauts on top. And I wanted to sort of get your insight into what that means, what the umlaut actually means in and of itself,
Okay.
and whether you think there's any meaning to that. I think it might just be a surface level thing, but if you could provide any insight, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, umlaut in phonetics is a vowel change that involves fronting back vowels. So vowels like oo and o that are pronounced in the back of the mouth move to the front. So u and ö, like in German, Swedish, and so on.
Right. Okay.
The name comes from German, and it means well, literally the is. I don't know if you know any German, but it means around, and laut is a sound. So yeah, the translation doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, that's the meaning. It's a historical process that also affected English. It's why we say mice as the plural of mouse, for example. That's why we have an irregular plural of that sort. That's thanks to umlaut.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Sound change process. German, because you have meaning contrasts that are brought about by adding the umlaut, it's considered a separate letter of the alphabet, and you'll see it as a separate letter on computer keyboards and so on. And because so many languages use them, Turkish, for example, makes use of that convention too. They're very commonly used foreign characters where they don't belong, in a sense, in part because I think for two reasons. One is because it makes the language look more exotic. You'll see them used by, for example, heavy metal bands. That's a pretty long tradition. It makes it look a bit more rock and roll,
Right.
Like
Yeah.
Motorhead, they used an umlaut, and Motley Crue and bands like that. So that's been going on since, I don't know, the 70s at least, probably before that even, where this association with, what's the association? I suppose like it's a bit hard to put into words, but I think you know what I'm driving at. The sort of
definitely, yeah.
The age of heroes and warfare and the sorts of things that people associate with Germanic mythology, that kind of stuff. It's
right. Okay.
That fits with the sort of gloomy and what's the right word? Sepulchral image of some heavy metal bands.
Okay. Yeah.
You get the idea. So, but the other thing, I think this is more likely, is that people use umlaut symbols as a way of bypassing filters in social media platforms, like in Twitter.
Right. Yeah.
So you can use obscenities like the F word, the C word, and if you use a U umlaut, it doesn't get picked up by the obscenity filters.
Okay. Yeah.
So you'll see people using, as a way of ensuring that their message gets across, because it's still readable. It's not like using some other exotic letter. If it's a U with an umlaut, everybody knows how to read the word.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I see with a cedilla underneath or something like that. So that could be something to do with it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know why this artist would want to do that, because it just makes things harder to find by search engines. And
Mm.
if he wants people to listen to his artistic creations, you'd think, well, but on the flip side of that could be, if you're in the know, it's a maybe it's some kind of badge of um, youth culture. Could it be, people who know how
Right.
to bypass obscenity filters on social media tend to be younger, I suppose. I don't know, but maybe that's got, so it's alluding to that, perhaps. Uh, art.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do agree with what you're saying in terms of, um, it could complicate things when people are searching,
Mm,
on Spotify, Apple Music, whatever streaming service, or
yeah,
outside of that, just on Google or whatever their search engine may be.
yeah,
Um, and then, like I say, like you said as well, on the flip side, that people can sort of identify themselves by that, but also I think it's assisted in sort of cultivating like a cult sort of following, in
yeah.
that yes, there may be a bit of a barrier to entry, in that you might not necessarily understand why there's these strange umlauts appearing above certain
Mm,
letters, and it may be hard to search for. But once you found that, you sort of I don't know how to phrase this, but you sort of get used to that sort of brand identity, and you can sort of align yourself with that.
yeah.
And then it's an easy thing to use as well. It's really easy to share in terms of, just on an iPhone or Android or whatever you're using, you just hold down the letter in question, and,
Mm,
there's so many symbols available. It's not a difficult thing to understand. And I think as well, it sort of helps that it doesn't go beyond that surface level, in that it's just using it, but not, using it for its proper purpose as well, I would
yeah.
say.
It's just decoration, really. It's in the same way that those other bands that I mentioned, Blue Oyster Cult, there's another one that just sprang to mind.
Yeah.
It's quite a commonly used thing. It just looks cool, I suppose. In this kind of music, it's maybe appears cool for a different reason. It's
Right.
it's done for a different reason. But like when Prince changed his name just to that funny looking squiggle hieroglyph thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, people who were big fans of his probably thought, "Oh, I need to learn how to draw that because I'm a big fan of his." I remember my brother was a big fan of Led Zeppelin back in the 80s, and they have
Right. Yeah.
sort of arcane, I don't know what they are, insignia of different kinds to represent the band members, and he used to sit very carefully drawing those on his jeans and on school books. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's part of just buying into the fandom, I suppose, like you say.
Yeah. Okay, great. And there was one more question I had for you as well.
Mm,
I didn't know if you could sort of gain an idea of this from the clips that I shared with you, but the artist doesn't really, like I say, articulate his words all that clearly, not all the time, but on occasion, and they sort of blend together.
mm.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, whether that you think that's an artistic choice, or the sort of impact you think that has, whether that helps his cause in trying to be found online, or whether that hinders that, or what your thoughts might be.
To me, it sounded really natural what he was doing. It didn't sound like he was forcing it very much.
Right.
The description I would use is, call it lax articulation, basically, where you're not enunciating in a careful and clear way.
Yeah.
In much the way that we just talk day to day with friends, family members, not, the opposite end of the spectrum from a careful telephone or job interview voice or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, that relaxed mode of articulation sounds comfortable, I suppose, to this artist. It sounds like he's not trying to be smart or clever with it. Just, do you know how scripted the lyrics are? Is this all written out in advance, or do you think there's some element of improvisation going on?
I would suggest, like most music in this sort of genre, in this sort of space, that it's probably improvised. but not all in one take, over a few takes, sort of thing like that. I don't think he would necessarily write his lyrics, and I would say that's probably intentional as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if that's the case, it's an interesting art form, just like the scat tradition in traditional jazz, just gobbledygook that jazz artists use, people like Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway, people like that. They just back in the 30s, maybe even before that, it probably predates that, but that was a trend in music. Just an example that most people would know is the I Want to Be Like You song from the Jungle Book, where they're making a reference to that. At the time, people who were accomplished in it, it was a vocal style that was really celebrated. It was, if you were good at that, just making up this gibberish on the fly, that was considered quite an accomplishment, as a sign of somebody who was a real, really committed to the whole jazz scene.
Okay, yeah.
Minnie the Moocher, that's a song that through the Blues Brothers movie that became quite well known. That's got some scat talk in there as well. So this might not be a million miles away from that 70s funk as well. You had people who like, are you familiar with Parliament? George Clinton, that kind of.
George Clinton, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
So he was a member of a band called Parliament back in the 70s, and they did a lot of this kind of verbal invention, just nonsense words. There's a song called what's it called? It's quite interesting lyrically because it sounds like they're using a lot of obscenities, but if you listen to it really carefully, I don't think there's any point where you can say he just said a rude word. It's just it sounds like that.
Right. Okay.
What the heck is it called? I know this song quite well. Well, it's not important, but that's a.
I'm sure it will come to you later when you least expect it.
No doubt it will. But that when I played the first song, I was immediately reminded of that song,
Right.
the Parliament song. No, the name's just not going to come, but
that's fine. Don't worry about it.
yeah, and there's lots of other examples like that. The song Louie Louie, is that one that you're familiar with?
Right. Yeah.
The censors didn't know what to do with that because they thought, well, we can't understand what these guys, the singer is saying. It's just this mumbled gibberish.
Yeah.
But we think that it might be saying something obscene, or it might be talking about drug taking. There's something going on that we don't approve of. We just don't know what it is.
Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Again, that's something that sprang to mind when you first said what the issue was here.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And just as well, just to sort of circle back to the sort of the manner of speaking that he incorporates, or manner of singing, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that more sort of conversational tone and way of speaking, do you think that's important for music, and I think something that it would appeal to fans and has sort of led to this artist gaining popularity, or is it not so much of a factor as I'm making it out to be? Or
No, I think if it's part of the vocal style, that artist's particular way of delivering that's part and parcel of what makes an artist popular, oftentimes, isn't it? You think about. I gave a talk actually earlier today about copywriting voices and whether that was possible, and does it make a difference if you're very recognizable when you sing or speak? And so some of the examples I used, there was a court case in the States involving a Tom Waits impersonator, and
right.
the estate of Tom Waits said, we think you're trying to cash in on the positive image that lots of people have with Tom Waits and his style of singing. Yeah, I mean it's not uncommon to find lawsuits which involve this a kind of an allegation of identity theft or something by using voice imitation for
Sure,
commercial
yeah.
ends. So yeah, it's part of the brand for sure. If I think about the very relaxed delivery, what's another good example of that? Somebody like Mark Knopfler, maybe. He sort of mumbles while he talks. Bob Dylan, he's an absolutely
Yeah, of course,
bluesy
yeah.
figure. But you wouldn't want him to sing those songs in any other way. Who else? JJ Cale, for example. I don't know if that's an artist, but he just kind of
Not familiar, no.
mutters along to the music. And quite often he sings songs about drug taking. His best known song is probably Cocaine, which I'm sure you'll have heard at some point.
It's a bit on the nose, that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pun intended.
Yeah. So, it just wouldn't sound right if he was belting it out in the style of he was in a Broadway musical or something. It's got to be that very relaxed, kind of mumbled style, and that's what fits.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring up imitation, because obviously we've seen lawsuits. Like the most recent one that comes to mind is Ed Sheeran with his chord progression.
Yeah.
Was similar to a previous song, and whether that was a case of copying or not. And obviously, when it comes to that chord progression, from what little I read about it, it seemed to me like it's a common thing. It wasn't specifically stolen from that. There's plenty of examples of songs that have that similar sound within their choruses.
Yeah.
But like you said, that's interesting that people would be perceived to have imitated vocal stylings and tones as well. That's very interesting. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the questions I had. Thank you so much for your time, obviously, and bye for now. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheerio, Cameron. Bye.
Bye.